It's all right.
Welcome, everyone, to our second talk in 2024. And we are super excited to host Dr. Beatrice Jauregui from the University of Toronto today. Before I introduce Bea, I want to start us off in a good way and respectfully acknowledge that the Center for
Welcome everyone to our second talk in 2024, and we are super excited,
which is a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, the Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. So I'm happy that the CCR is hosting Professor Jauregui today. Her research addresses how security institutions and actors reflect and shape dynamics of social order and state power. She has written a truly fascinating book called Provisional Authority, Police, Order, and Security in India, which was published with the University of Chicago, I believe in 2016. Yeah. And it is an ethnography of everyday police practices in northern India. If you haven't read the book, you absolutely should, and I would encourage you to do so. Bea is also the co-editor of the Anthropology and Global Counterinsurgency edited collection with the University of Chicago and the Sage Handbook of Global Policing in 2016. And the author of numerous other book chapters and articles that I can't all mention. She's also currently the principal investigator for a project that is entitled Police Unions, Democratic Transformation and Social Justice, which is a comparative transnational study of organized policing, identity, and labor-oriented police associations and police governance and politics in South Asia, Latin America, and Turtle Island, North America. And so it is my sincere pleasure to have you here today, and I'll give it over to you. Thank you so much for your talk.
Okay, thank you so much, Sandra, and to everyone who assisted with the organizing for this invitation. I'll just apologize in advance. There's a little bit of work going on in my house, so I hope there's not too much noise. But yes, thank you again. This is really exciting for me, especially because it's some relatively new research. I mean, it's been going on for a couple of years now, but as yet I haven't published or presented on any of this material really outside of some of the communities that I've been working with. So this is a sort of premiere in a way too, and I'm very much looking forward to your feedback and the discussion. So the title of the talk is Policing by, for, and of Indigenous Communities, the State of the Art. And I wanted to highlight the by/for/of portion of that title, since to date, it seems that most critical research that has been done on policing and Indigenous communities across Turtle Island or North America has highlighted how settler colonial, state law enforcement bodies at various levels, federal, provincial, municipal, historically have and continue to contribute to discriminatory treatment and disproportionate representation of Indigenous community members in the criminal justice system. And this is, of course, a very important and ongoing set of issues about which there still remains much to be done. However, the research that I'm going to be presenting on today focuses primarily on what are known as self-administered or stand-alone police organizations within some Indigenous communities. So I'm going to speak briefly first just a little bit about the history of self-administered Indigenous policing, and then share with you some initial findings from fieldwork that I've been conducting with several communities and also with a collective body which perhaps you've heard of. It's known as the First Nations Chiefs of Police Association, or FNCPA. So the aim of this talk really is to consider some of the tensions that inhere in the structures and practices of self-administered Indigenous police organizations, which are spaces or kind of fields of sovereignty and self-governance on the one hand, but on the other, because they are police, right? It's a very fraught institution. They're also, as you might imagine, sources of controversy and sometimes even conflict and violence within the communities that they serve. So first, just a bit of context. There have been these kinds of police, these self-administered or standalone police institutions in some communities here on Turtle Island since at least the 1970s. Though most of them, the few that existed since then, had limited or no recognition at all by federal and local governments for many years. In the 1960s, as you may know, there was the Canadian federal government implemented what was known as the Band Constable program. So this was supposed to essentially provide kind of supplemental policing. It served about 45 First Nations, most of which were located in Manitoba. There were also 6 in Alberta and I think 5 in New Brunswick. And so band constables, they were not considered, full or, sworn police officers. Rather, they were more of a kind of a community-based, non-policing presence, right? That was basically there to enforce local bylaws, but really just kind of assisting either the RCMP or the provincial police, whoever was the police of jurisdiction. And this program, it was severely under-resourced and rife with all kinds of problems and tensions. So in 1991, the government established what's now known as the First Nations Police Program, or FNPP. And so the idea was to reorganize and enhance support for policing in Indigenous communities. Though in fact, actually this FNP, it didn't fully replace that old band constable program. That actually wasn't officially canceled until quite recently, 2015. But the FNPP, or what's also referred to as the FNIPP to distinguish Inuit communities specifically, it was founded primarily as essentially a financial cost-sharing arrangement between the Canadian federal government and whatever provincial governments might surround a particular First Nations territory. So whereas the Band Constable program was 100% federal, in this case, the FNPP, it's basically a split of 52% of funding comes from the federal government and 48% comes from provincial governments. And it's administered now by Public Safety Canada and generally supports 2 types. So there are kind of 2 types of policing in Indigenous communities. The one that I'm going to be focusing on, this self-administered or standalone, that's where the community itself provides day-to-day services. And it's, the policing, it's essentially, there's an agreement between whatever community council that governs on the territory and the provincial government that's adjacent to or surrounding the territory. The second form, which I'm happy to talk about a bit in the Q&A, but it's not really what I'm focusing on, are just what are known as CTAs, or community tripartite agreements. So that's where essentially a contingent of officers from the RCMP provide dedicated policing to an Indigenous community, basically as a kind of supplement to whatever province or other local bodies are there. So again, unlike this older band constable program, where they were sort of like special constables under provincial legislation, police under the FNPP are full sworn officers with full legal powers. They do have a somewhat liminal status, though, because not all self-administered First Nations police do what's known as opting in to provincial legislation, usually, the whatever police act. At least that's true here in Ontario. I think in Quebec, they don't actually have the option. And there are pros and cons to this in terms of especially things like resources, access to government pensions for the police officers and such. But many of these self-administered organizations feel, that they don't want to opt in because then they'll be hamstrung by provincial laws and all kinds of issues. So in practice, even those officers who are employed under, again, an official self-administered agreement, they're still often made to feel like auxiliaries, right? Like they often refer to themselves as kind of second class or lower class officers, and they're not considered real police. So at the time that the FNPP was created back in 1991, there were 58 of these standalone or self-administered Indigenous police organizations. Now, just over 30 years later, there are only 36 such organizations within, the boundaries of what we call Canada. 21 of them are in Quebec province. There are 9 in Ontario, 3 in Alberta, and 1 each in BC and Saskatchewan and Manitoba. So you can see there's been a significant decrease, actually almost 40% decrease in the 3 decades since the program was established in these standalone organizations, which has been part of a variety of trends, actually, that lead some scholars and policymakers to declare that this First Nations police program was set up to fail, right? That's actually the title of an article. And this program has come under increasing and quite intensive criticism, especially by First Nations police chiefs themselves and other local leaders in many Indigenous communities, as essentially, they're inadequate to the task. So this program, rather, is inadequate to the task of supporting policing in these communities, never mind improving it or perhaps positively transforming it, but just, giving the bare minimum. So this is a key part of why collectives like the FNCPA, again, that's the First Nations Chiefs of Police Association, they're organizing around this issue of that what they're trying to do is push the federal government to pass legislation that will officially recognize First Nations policing as an essential service that's on par with federal, provincial, and other police. Now, as you might imagine, this process of trying to gain legislative recognition has been very drawn out, very politically complicated. Especially since it's actually the AFN, the Association of First Nations, rather than the FNCPA itself that's doing the negotiating with the government. And I'll just say currently there's a lot of feelings of discouragement that it's not actually going to happen, especially in light of, we have national elections looming. But so that's just a little bit of, the kind of macro level political history that configures policing by, for, and of Indigenous communities here. And I'm happy to discuss some of these things further, in the Q&A. But what I wanted to do now is turn to some of the more, kind of meso and micro level dynamics of self-administered policing in a few specific communities with whom I've been working for the past couple of years, alongside one of our PhD students here at U Toronto, who I think may be here in the audience, I'm not sure, Roxy Schlapbeck, who I hope is here. So she's been doing her dissertation research on police community relations in Akwesasne, which is a Kanien'kehá:ka or Mohawk community, where the territory actually crosses both provincial and international borders. So you've got Quebec, Ontario, and New York State in the US surrounding it, making it exceptionally complex in terms of, they actually have a quadripartite agreement, not a tripartite agreement. And the other community that we've been working in is Ganawage, which is a sister community just a little bit east. So just a little bit first about how we came to this work and a description of some of the methods. The entree really was this working with this First Nations Chiefs of Police association since, as Sandra mentioned in the introduction, for the last couple of years, I've been running a study titled Police Unions, Democratic Transformation and Social Justice, which is funded by a SSHRC Insight grant. So this project it's a much larger longitudinal and transnational qualitative comparison of various forms of collective organizing and political actions by police in South Asia and Latin America, and also here in North America. So we began following the activities of the FNCPA, which again, so this is itself kind of a transnational Indigenous-led organization. Although I will point out it's very much dominated by Gani and Gahaka police chiefs. So there's a very kind of Haudenosaunee, like heavy influence, which I very much plan to explore the implications of this in the future. And so essentially we met some of the current and former leaders of this association who then invited us to visit their communities and just observe everyday policing on the ground, and also meet with some local residents, community members. So we've been making periodic visits since 2022, speaking with and also shadowing some, not just the police chiefs, but also just rank and file officers, civilian administrators, also meeting with local council members and other community members, just to, get a sense of what the key issues are on the ground. So just to frame these research sites a little bit, I first want to point out that these are actually quite small police organizations. They're approximately, I think there are about 28 officers on the U.S. side in Akwesasne. That's so it's actually there are two in Akwesasne. There's the St. Regis Tribal Police on the U.S. side, and then the Akwesasne Mohawk Police on the Canadian side. And then in Ganawage, they have about, sorry, I'm just getting a call. Oh, sorry, I thought there was a technical difficulty. Sorry. In Ganawage, they have about 36 officers. So, on average, about 30 to 40 officers. And so that, I think that also includes civilian staff in each of these organizations. And the jurisdiction covers populations ranging from about 9 to 10,000 in Ganawage to approximately 12,000 in Akwesasne. So these are they're essentially kind of like small town police, although they're certainly not nearly as remote or rural as some other self-administered Indigenous police, especially, in Ganawage, they're just across the bridge from Montreal and adjacent to the suburb of Chateauguay there. So it's really kind of more of a peri-urban scene there. And I also wanted to know, just in terms of some of the demographics of these police organizations themselves, the Ganawage peacekeepers, and notably, they don't actually call themselves police, though their uniforms certainly mark them as such. They are 100% status, community members. I think 95% are actually from the Ganawage community itself, including the chief. In Akwesasne, it's a little bit different, though. The majority of people do have Indigenous status, but only about 60% actually live on the territory or in the community. And actually, the chief, for the first time, the current police chief in Akwesasne is not only not a community member, but not Indigenous himself, which since 2017, he came in. There have been some tensions around this. So what I want to share in the time I have remaining, it relates primarily to some of these tensions that I mentioned earlier between, on the one hand, definitely a demonstrated, community desire for, and oftentimes relatively satisfaction with these police organizations. But on the other hand, a significant quality and quantity of distrust of, and sometimes a lot of dissatisfaction with these organizations for a host of historical and structural and socio-legal reasons. So, Many people do, I really want to emphasize, many people do really appreciate and like these self-administered police, not least because it means they don't have to be subject to outsiders from the RCMP or, other like SQ or other provincial police coming in, or at least they're less subject to it, depending on the case. And so it means that the community really they can have a kind of sense of control to some extent over the police and other local governance matters. But there are also a host of reasons why many people would rather not have a standalone police in the community. And in some cases, they've literally attacked the stations or even run them off the territory. So I wanted to consider these tensions from a kind of plurality of perspectives, certainly from the perspective of police officers themselves at various ranks, and also from the perspectives of members of the community at large. Of course, keeping in mind that, as I just mentioned, the majority of police in both of these communities are living there on the territory. They are from the community itself. So, I've already said a little bit about this essential services issue, right? That where Indigenous police chiefs are trying to get the government to actually legislate, to put into law recognition of them as an essential service, not only because, of course, they want to be taken seriously, not just seen as, a kind of enhancement to the real police, but real police in their own right. But the recognition, it's not only important for things like this, which has implications for getting adequate funding, getting access to other kinds of resources, but also crucially because they want to shore up and strengthen their legitimacy within their communities, right? So they can say, look, we're very much a needed service that is for the community, right? We're from the community and we're for the community. And so one of the key lines that we keep hearing from the top brass, the kind of police leaders, is that this is community policing par excellence, right? They're like, this is the real definition of community policing, which I think, of course, begs many questions, not least, what does that even mean, right? Like how, of course, we've heard the community policing as a broad ideology and practice of policing in North America since the 1990s. But, when they say it here in these specific communities that have these very particular and troubled histories, what does that actually mean? How is it perhaps maybe similar to so-called community policing in other places, but perhaps also very different? And I would also just want to point out that even in these two communities where we've been working, like even there, like community, the daily realities, like what policing actually looks like every day, can be very different. Since, as I mentioned, Akwesasne, it's on the border. They have, a host of, they may have like, say, fewer daily calls than police in Ganawage, but they have a lot of issues related to, trafficking, smuggling of firearms, drugs, just all kinds, and people, of course, human trafficking as well, that they don't have in their sister community. And there are also these jurisdictional issues too, right? Like, in both cases, the police there, they are enforcing or subject to Mohawk law, but they're at the same time, they also have to enforce the Canadian Criminal Code, and they're also subject to the Indian Act. So there's this really kind of snarled, set of legal constraints that are put on them, and then at the cross-border area too, like in St. Regis on the U.S. side of Akwesasne, for example, they're not subject to Canadian law, but they have to. They are subject to New York state law and penal codes. So there are all kinds of problematic implications for what this means, right? Especially when we talk about self-governance and policing as one mode or one sign of self-determination. Now, when we speak with the, more of the rank and file, your kind of workaday cops, the constables and sergeants, some of the issues, certainly some of the issues that the chiefs and the leaders raise trickle down there, but they're much more concerned, the rank and file, with, again, kind of the everyday working conditions. So certainly the lack of manpower. Again, these are very, very small, very under-resourced organizations. And also the ways that, I just mentioned the jurisdictional issues, but, the way that plays out for, the constables, and, there are all kinds of things. Like, for example, they can't wear their uniforms. The Canadian officers can't wear their uniforms on the US side because they technically don't have jurisdiction there. There's all kinds of, there can be issues of communication and different priorities on different sides of the border. In both cases, and arguably in all cases, they really struggle with retention and recruitment because a lot of people, they tend to use, like, they'll get the job, but then well, it's kind of a stepping stone to maybe a better policing job elsewhere with provincial or other police. So there are all these kinds of working conditions that are of concern to the rank and file. And there are also, of course, the social conditions in which they are working. These communities, they struggle with, all of the negative indicators that you might imagine, from poverty and unemployment to, very high rates of addiction, domestic violence, family violence, etc. So, and of course, so in that sense, these self-administered Indigenous police, they're dealing with a lot of the same kinds of problems as other neighboring police. But, there are significant differences too, because it is their own community. Many of them struggle with what they call the fishbowl problem, right? That they're essentially enforcing this host of laws against their own families and neighbors. So, there's this kind of sense that they're always on duty because, you're running into the guy that you just arrested 2 hours ago in the store or at the bank, or whatever, just because it's such a, which again, in some ways, this is like any small town, right? Or any kind of maybe rural setting. But then with the added factor of, the history of settler colonialism and the fact that many of these officers, they're often kind of called like sellouts or, even traitors sometimes. You're not a real community member. You're enforcing the white man's law, right? So there's even just, things like just kind of jealousy. It is, in communities where there are high rates of unemployment and things, this is actually a relatively good job with significant resources and benefits, and people may just be envious. Of course, there's also a lot of speculation, sometimes, not unfounded, that, things like nepotism go into who even gets a job, etc. So there are all kinds of things that that the police leadership and also police boards have to contend with in terms of the ways that the community views the police institution. And so this is how I think we can get to some of the tensions that we can see when we think about the community at large. So one of the things I wanted to mention was how in Ghanaian Hakka communities, there are these long established cultural practices of essentially everyone getting a voice in local governance matters. So they're what are known as community decision-making practices or traditional CDMs that take place in the Longhouse. And so that's, it's supposed to be this like egalitarian spirit. Everyone gets a voice. And yet some conversations and observations have suggested that, certainly that the community is far from fully egalitarian. There are all kinds of internal fractures, as there are in any community, but, whether it's along lines of wealth or influence, ideologies of governance, or just, kind of old historical, maybe family feuds, things like this. And policing practices and relationships reflect many of these inequalities or conflicts that exist in the broader community. So, for example, there in both communities actually, but especially in Akwesasne, there have been conflicts over whether or not casinos should reside on the land as, a major source of revenue. So since the 1980s, that has been a significant source of conflict in the community and also a significant source of, criminogenic activity. And more recently, there have also been some conflicts over, the cannabis industry since cannabis was federally legalized here in Canada. So that's, those are some of the, you could say, kind of more political economic sources of tension in the communities, but there are also more cultural sorts of differences. So people known as traditionalists who follow, the longhouse spirituality and governance. And even within that, there are fractures, and then others who are, either people who converted to Christianity, people who perhaps married someone from outside the community, and so now they're not allowed to live on the territory. In Akwesasne, again, there are even just kind of divides between people who live on the north side, on the Canadian side, and the U.S. side. So there are a host of ways in which, the community itself, again, as in any community, there are struggles and conflicts. And so then the way that this manifests, or the way it shapes policing, is something that, that really needs to be contended with. And the police themselves struggle, right? At the same time, there have also been, it's been shared that many community members say they would like more engagement with the police, or for more outreach by police. In fact, some have said that it used to be, that the police used to be more community oriented, but for some reason now it seems like there's increasing distance. People will say things like, "Oh, now they roll up their windows, and we used to know everybody, but now it feels like they don't really want to deal with us." So some attribute this to generational issues. Some say, "Oh no, it's more a matter of there are more people more officers from outside the community." It's likely a combination of factors. But so in general, people they agree that, having your own police, keeping out the RCMP or the provincial or whatever municipal police is a good thing, but, it's still police. So even if all of the officers are from the community, a number of people feel like, well, you're still working for a colonial institution, right? That does all kinds of harms. So this has come out in a lot of the conversations that I've had with a number of officers. I'm sorry about this landline. Can you just turn this off? I usually get calls on this line anyway, but now it's not working. My apologies. So just to wrap up, I really am eager to hear some of your thoughts and have a discussion. I'll just say, there are these tensions, and there's still so much work to do, so much that we still don't know. So I thought I'd just, for a couple of minutes, discuss what I think would be some, directions for future research. First, we definitely need to have a better understanding of what people mean when they say this is community policing. There are so many stakeholders, and it's going to mean different things to different people. So we really don't know much about how actively community members do get involved in shaping policing policies in these cases. We know there are these police boards, kind of similar to what you have in other municipal policing services, but there are all kinds of questions around what does it mean to be a culturally sensitive police, that really prioritizes community perspectives, traditional justice approaches, and these kinds of things. And how do we build this knowledge in collaborative ways, that work in line with calls for, community-led research, which, again, bearing in mind that the communities themselves are complex and often fractured things. And the second thing I would say is we really need to understand or improve our understandings of whether and how these standalone Indigenous police services and their governance by the community, how may they be considered fundamental to the autonomy of these First Nations communities, and also crucial for things like cultural preservation, cultural revitalization, and in line with much broader principles from, things like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which affirms, the rights of self-governance. These kinds of principles are also present in the calls to justice for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and even in some ways in the original First Nations policing policy itself. So these frameworks, they're there to support First Nations communities in governing themselves, in making independent decisions, and when necessary, of course, engaging with federal and provincial governments. But we really need to understand better, what this means, especially, and this brings us back to that essential services legislation that the chiefs have been pushing for. How do these kinds of self-administered police organizations help communities actually uphold their own laws, right, in ways that align with their own cultural values and norms? So there are also many questions about how self-administered Indigenous policing may intersect with the policing of other populations or the public at large, however that may be conceived. So I think earlier I mentioned how in Ganawage, which is right next to Montreal, they said, over 100,000 people pass through this territory every day, mostly as commuters going to the city. So, there are ways in which, while the police may be for the community of Ganawage, they also, of course, have to engage with people from outside the community. I also know there are cases such as the Tsuut'ina Nation there in Alberta, which I believe is the first Indigenous police service that's also contracted to serve non-Native communities in and around Calgary. So all kinds of questions. There's so much more to know, so much work to do. But I'm going to go ahead and stop here. And thank you again. I really look forward to hearing your thoughts and questions on all of this. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Bea. Everyone who feels comfortable, please turn your cameras on, or you can also keep them off. Oh, Brittany already has a question, so I will just give it over to Brittany to start us off, and we'll take it from there. Thank you so much.
Great.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Brittany.
Perfect. Hi. Thank you so much for your talk. It was really interesting, and we really enjoyed it. So my question, I'm wondering if you could elaborate on the mostly Haudenosaunee influence on the self-led Indigenous policing practices. So more specifically, how does the Haudenosaunee approaches to policing compare to other Indigenous community approaches? Because Indigenous communities aren't monolithic, so I'm wondering what might be some of the areas of tension or complementary on the ground amongst different approaches to Indigenous-led policing?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really great question. And I think there's still a lot, it's to be determined. I'm still learning and figuring this out myself. What I would say, so when I said it, there was Haudenosaunee or really Kanien'kehá:ka, like Mohawk kind of dominance. It's with that FNCPA, that First Nations Chiefs of Police association, where they have, I think, 6 board members and half of them are from Kanien'kehá:ka communities. And I think it's interesting to think of that, especially in light of the fact that that previous program I mentioned, that band constable program, that seemed a much more, it was much heavier in the Western provinces. So, well, central Western, especially Manitoba. But in this self-administered, again, these self-administered, I mean, as I also mentioned, most of them are in Quebec. So, and that's not all Haudenosaunee. So that, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy is down more, a little bit more south. I mean, it stretches, but I do think there's something to just the idea of, you could say, confederacy itself, and that like we have to get together as a collective in order to make any real substantive headway politically, to gain recognition and to be able to live and work and serve our communities in the way that we feel is necessary to actually manifest sovereignty. So I don't know if I have a definitive answer yet, but I really do think there is something there that that goes way back to kind of old practices of confederation and getting together to say, okay, how are we going to govern in a way that's protecting ourselves and allowing us to really realize our vision of how to live. I hope that. Thank you. It's a really good question.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
I don't see a hand up right now, but I do have a question. If you, Kevin, you'll be after me, sorry. And if you have any questions, then please just chime in or type it into the chat. So you spoke a little bit about the fact that communities are complex, obviously, and it's not really clear who decides what community policing is or is not. So I guess I'm throwing this question back at you as a policing scholar. Like who defines what community policing is? Like who should have the most say, I guess, in a community, or how do we think about that, given that there are so many different actors in communities? And it's always unclear to me anyways, when we study these topics, who we should pay most attention to, or how we can sort of like get at the question of who really says this is what it is, because there are so many different ideas and complexities and fractures in communities. So how do you go about that?
Yeah, it's so challenging. Even in now because we've been invited by the chiefs, that's kind of the invitation, and then we sort of have to meet people in the community, of course, only as they're willing, but we meet through the chiefs. And then so this whole time I've been struggling with this question of how much am I just meeting with very specific kind of elites in the community, because it has become clear in a number of conversations, even though people are leery of going into too much detail, which of course is their right. And I'm thinking of like Audra Simpson's book, right, on refusal, and especially in the Mohawk. This is one of them is the community where she was doing her work. So people are very cagey when they say, like, they'll say, yeah, there's nepotism, or yeah, like only certain families were dominating in the local council or in policing. But they don't want to say who, and it's just it's very tricky. So I don't know, in terms of who we should listen to, I think we should try to speak to and listen to everyone. You mean as researchers, right? Not just, or like you're also kind of asking like who should be making those decisions. I mean, it seems like the ideal is that everyone, they will have gatherings at the Longhouse on a host of issues and say, okay, what does everybody think? Even, for example, we've offered to help them do a kind of survey, because there has been interest expressed in more engagement between police officers and community members. So we've said, if you want our help, we'd be happy to try to facilitate just a survey, like among community members, of what they'd like to see more or less of, just basic what's working, what's not. But even that, that has to go to a community decision-making body or meeting, I guess, that has to be done before, anything like that can happen. So I don't know. I guess I just have to see who else will be willing to work with us, and I don't know. It's a really good question. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you. And Kevin, I will bump you to later into the row if that's okay. So Sabine, is that how I pronounce your name? You go first, please.
Hi, B.
Hi,
I guess I have two questions. The first one is you mentioned something earlier about how police officers might run into people that they already know, what part of their community, after just arresting them and so on and so forth. So this first question was triggered by that. And I was wondering if you were able to observe examples of restorative justice practices when community policing is engaged during instances of interpersonal conflicts or disputes. That was my first question. And then the second question, I'm thinking about identity and how community police officers can have dual sort of sometimes even conflictual identities all at once. So they're Indigenous and yet they're also policing their community, trying to balance Indigenous practices with a colonial institution that is actually hiring them. So in relationship to this, what does community policing role look like in terms of, this massive, now it's actually a national campaign into looking at our investigation into Indigenous and missing and murdered missing and murdered Indigenous women. So what is the role of policing there? And then also I'm thinking about Wet'suwet'en N, in which RCMP are sent in to actually remove Indigenous people from their lands. And yeah, so I'm thinking about identity, I'm thinking about policing, I'm thinking about, this colonial project that oftentimes does remove Indigenous people from their land. So how, I was wondering if any of those sort of themes were brought up during your fieldwork.
Yeah, no, thank you. Most definitely. It threads throughout. And I just quickly on the first question about restorative justice, when we've been on patrol, I haven't actually seen, there are circles. They have implemented that in these two communities, although they said it's actually a relatively recent thing that they've started doing them. So I didn't actually witness any restorative justice circles, which are usually things that happen kind of as alternatives to, prosecution or court. On patrols with police, certainly, we could observe things like just generally like trying to de-escalate, like they say, and most of it has come through conversations of police, telling us about instances so far rather than me actually observing one. But they say that they're, because they are members of the community themselves, they often know people. I went on calls where, a guy's grandmother called him, or and another woman, her aunt called, and, they'll say things like, oh, my very first call, I had to arrest my best friend's father, so there are these very intimate ties where even if it's not a formal restorative justice circle or proceeding, there's always this sensibility that these are my family, my neighbors. And so they say, like, there is probably more so than in other police organizations, just a real predisposition to try to work things out, to try to mediate, to de-escalate, in ways that, more mainstream police, that it's just not there, that tendency. Related to the many questions, I think, that were embedded in the second portion of what you were saying, but specifically linked with what you mentioned around the identity of the police officers themselves. This is something that pretty much everyone that I've spoken with or shadowed has talked about, and some with more lament than others. They definitely do feel, they feel the tugs and the tensions, and the fact that, okay, I have to go to, like, they train at the RCMP depot in Regina. So it's not, they haven't been hired by the RCMP. It's the self-administered, the organization itself hires the police. They're not being hired by RCMP or provincial police. It is independent, And yet they do have to often work together with police, from these federal, provincial, or especially in the case of Montreal, municipal police. And it's really tough because for the community, they try as best as they can to keep those other police out, but sometimes you can't, depending on if a case has crossed lines of the territory and various things. So as I mentioned, they often they get called traitors, they get called apples, right? The red on the outside, white on the inside, those kinds of slurs. And it's not just the officers themselves, their families feel it too, right? So if there's some kind of conflict, or an officer arrested someone and their family's angry, their families also feel that heat and that challenge from the community. So it's very, very difficult. They're always in this kind of in-between place because of the history and the ongoing, issues, as you mentioned, Wet'suwet'en and so many other places where Indigenous people are being mistreated. Also, the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls that you mentioned. A lot of those cases are considered, police failures, right? That it was really a policing. It starts with the police. So so much there. It's a really challenging position for them. Thanks.
Hey, we have two questions on the chat. One is from Leanne, who says, "Thanks for a great talk. Can you elaborate on some of the jurisdictional issues in I'm not going to pronounce it correctly. Akwesasne? Yeah.
Yeah.
Do police officers report a sense of role conflict in their work due to the differing demands based on their geographical location?"
Yes, Akwesasne is so it's so interesting, and I'm not sure if Roxy's still here, but she's been working there now for many months, and observing. So it's the territory. It sits part of it's in Ontario, part of it's in what people call Quebec, and then part of it's in New York State. There are actually people there are roads that the north side of the roads in Canada, the south side's in, there are even houses, they say, where the kitchen's in New York and the living room's in Ontario. It's crazy. So, and also especially the fact that not just in terms of, once charges have been laid, the laws and criminal justice system, the way that works, but even when police are, being called to a scene, they have to know, what happened where. And there's also the St. Lawrence River there. So there's water. And even there are a number of islands where, some of the islands are considered part of Canadian territory, even if it's Akwesasne, the supposedly, autonomous reserve. And then other islands in the water are considered, on US, so on that dividing line. So as far as you ask about role conflict, what's been reported to us, I think that I can say are, just sometimes there are things where the police on the US side and the police on the Canada side might have different priorities. In terms of what they feel they need to communicate about with one another, or even what they feel this is ours to deal with and that's yours to deal with. So just in terms of the cooperation between, so these are two, police forces that serve the Akwesasne community, but they're distinct. On the US side, they pay taxes in ways that they don't on Canadian. There are also issues of, they say sometimes the officers on the US side might even kind of defect to the Canadian side because they get better benefits in those jobs. So there are all kinds of tensions there, not just jurisdictional, but kind of more pragmatic and indeed in relation to what they consider to be their role, not just as police, but again, also as community members, right? So yeah, very complicated.
Okay, thank you. Kevin, how about you? You go next, and then we have one more question in the chat. You're muted, I think. I can't hear you.
Now.
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Too many microphones. Yeah, thanks, B. This is really important, kind of cutting edge stuff you're doing. I guess my question really goes back to where beginning where you started. You said that there's a contingent of people in the police community that sort of see these police arrangements, and you use the expression, they're inadequate to the task. So they're trying to pass legislation to make. So I'm just curious, in their eyes, what makes the current arrangements inadequate, and how are they envisioning legal change as fixing those inadequacies?
Yeah. So the legal I mean, most of the push for this legislation is coming from not just the police chiefs, but also like local leaders, right? So we're back to this issue of who, kind of what Sandra, her question alluded to was, who are the leaders in the community and what do they see? So, I mean, a significant issue, of course, is money. Just they feel that in general, the budgets are inadequate, so they don't, the usual kind of stuff. They don't have enough uniforms, equipment, all of that sort of thing. So there's just that kind of base material sort of sensibility that if we are recognized as essential, then we'll be able to hire more people and have more stable contracts. Because some of the other things that they have to do sometimes are even when the contract agreement is up. And if they haven't haven't been able to get the provincial or federal governments to provide more, they actually have to take out private loans sometimes and fund themselves. And so, I mean, there really is just, kind of a raw material resources element to it. But the other side, which I also tried to highlight, is, it's much more of a kind of, you could say, cultural sensibility of evaluation, right? And recognition of, who counts, which means it's not only about resources, but it's about who's going to listen to you or who's going to be willing to work with you, whether it's in the community or, again, like police or other government officials. So that piece about being seen as essential, it's like we're not just helpers. We are the police. We are the community, and that's who we're serving. So it's the resources and the recognition. I think those are kind of the two key elements which the chiefs and other leaders are saying we really we need this in legislation, because otherwise we're always going to be sidelined. We're always just going to be seen as, this kind of add-on that, that's not central and fundamental, which goes to sovereignty issues. I hope. Yeah.
It's not about legal empowerment. So it's not about, we don't have the legal tools to accomplish the tasks that we've been given.
No, I don't think so. The legal side of it is usually more about, some things that it's the criminal code. I mean, a homicide, you have to enforce the criminal code, but other things, especially when it comes to, like these local industries I mentioned, whether it's tobacco or cannabis or the gaming houses, that's where you get these legal tensions between Mohawk law and, if not the criminal code, then, and also the Indian Act, like what, which piece of law do we have to adhere to in a particular situation? And they often find themselves stuck especially between the criminal code and some of the Ganayakahaka, not just bylaws, but just traditional law, where they're just like, okay, we're just going to look the other way, and because we are Mohawk, and that's we have to enforce what's going to be important to the community. So there are legal challenges too, but I think the essential services thing is really more about what I mentioned before, the resources and recognition.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much. We're at the hour. So I know Emily had a question about gaining access. I don't know if you want to give a 30-second answer to that, but otherwise I think we will wrap it up because we're approaching 2:00. So she's essentially saying, thank you so much for your talk today, and is asking about the process of gaining access to these communities.
Yeah, I mean, of course you have to be very, very sensitive. I mean, I am a settler. I'm from outside, and so that's part of also why it's been very slow. Only saying, okay, we are here to help. What is going to help the community, right? Like, how can we work together? Not just, hi, I'm here as a researcher extracting the data, but that's why we're talking to people in a way that what do you think would be most beneficial, or what do you think people need to know about what's meaningful about having your own police organization.
Thank you. That's a great answer. Okay, thank you so much, Bea, for giving a fascinating talk and answering all of our questions. It was a pleasure to have you. You might have some people following up with you after, because I know we always have watchers on YouTube as well. But thank you so much for your time and your talk.
My pleasure. Thank you, everyone, for your really wonderful questions, and for giving me this opportunity. I really appreciate it. Thanks.